So we do not lose heart. Even though our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed day by day. For this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all measure. Because we look not at what can be seen, but what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal. For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling. If indeed when we have taken it off, we will not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent, we groan under our burden, because we wish not to be unclothed, but to be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up in life. So he who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So we are always confident, even though we know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we do have confidence, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So whether you are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
Recently, Ron Greer made me aware of a new book that is out. It is entitled, "I Love You, But I Hate Your Politics." It's a book that is written by a woman by the name of Jean Safer. She is a liberal Democrat, a psychologist, and a writer. And she is married to Richard Brookhiser. He is a conservative editor of the National Review magazine. She knows what it's like to live in a politically divided family. And she knows what it's also like to be able to not only survive in that environment, but also to thrive in that environment. And she suggests that there is one ironclad rule to keep in mind. You are not going to change the other person's mind politically. It's not going to happen. It's futile to even try. And you know that. You've got somebody that you disagree with politically, and as a result, you enjoy engaging them in debate. You're convinced you have the argument that they'll change their mind. And then you send them articles, or you attach articles to emails that you send to them. You are imagining them opening their email, reading the article, and going, "Wow, I've been wrong all this time." And then there is harmony in the relationship. And Safer says, get over it, it's not going to happen. She said it's far more constructive to realize that the other person is valued because of their differentness. Embrace their differentness. Enjoy their differentness from you. It is also more constructive to realize that what you have in common is greater than what you disagree on. You have in common more important things that bind you together. And if there are things that you completely disagree on, you can decide that I am going to engage in respectful conversation with you or I'm just going to give up altogether. It's your choice. As I was thinking about that article, there are a lot of similarities to the point that I'm trying to get across in this month's series, Beyond Us versus Them. We have been talking about some of the most divisive topics in the country and even in the church. And we are looking for ways to talk about those and to find common ground, to move beyond the us versus them thinking. We've talked about abortion, the death penalty, immigration, and today we've got one more, euthanasia. A teenager is pulled out of the wreckage of his car. He's whisked to the hospital. He lies in intensive care and is kept alive by machines. There is a young woman. She goes to the dermatologist expecting to have a mole removed from her back. It turns out to be a very serious form of skin cancer. Her treatments at MD Anderson barely slow the cancer down. And she finds herself a young, vibrant woman trapped in a dying body. There's an older woman who lies in her bed in an assisted living center. She's deaf. She can barely walk. She is in excruciating pain from arthritis all the time. Her biggest fear is being a burden to her children. And she prays daily, Lord, take me home. These are everyday circumstances that are happening in our communities. And maybe you have not encountered one of those personally, but trust me, one day you will. And when you are confronted with that kind of a situation, it's important to know what you believe and why you believe it about life, about death, and about euthanasia. Just like when we were talking about abortion, it's important to know when it begins. In abortion, we were talking about when life begins. Is it at conception? Is it at birth? Or is it somewhere in between? With euthanasia, when does death begin? When does life end? Is it when the heart stops beating? Is it when you're no longer able to live a productive life? Or is it somewhere in between? The word euthanasia literally means good death. There have been other phrases that have used to describe it. Mercy killing. When someone who is suffering unbearable pain and that person is put out of their misery. Nowadays, we call it a dignified death. We call it assisted death or assisted suicide. Let me be clear about what euthanasia is not. Euthanasia is not removing a loved one from life support systems. There are families that agonize over those kinds of decisions. There's a loved one who has been hooked up to life support, a ventilator, a heart machine, and that person is living because of the machines. And the doctors say, we're not sure the person is going to be able to get off of them. You have to make the decision. It's an agonizing decision. But taking the decision to take that person off of life support is not euthanasia. When that person dies, they are not dying because of your decision. They are dying because of the disease or the bodily condition that they are experiencing. That's the cause of death. And that is not euthanasia. I get the argument for euthanasia. I really do. People believe that they should have a right to decide when they die. It's my life. I should be able to decide. I get it. I understand that sometimes we outlive our ability to live life like we want to. And at those times we are looking for a release and we're looking for relief. And I'm okay with letting go. I understand that. There are people who talk about their pets. I love my pet. But when the vet tells me that my pet is going through great pain and is suffering and there's nothing the vet can do, we euthanize the pet. And people say, can't we use the same mercy for other loved ones, my human loved ones? I get it. I understand it. But I want you to know that the church and the scriptures have something to say to us on this subject. In the book of Genesis, in the 9th chapter, and Genesis literally means the beginning, God sets the parameters for our lives and says that life is in my domain, that it is not yours to give life, it is not yours to take life. It is my gift of life to you, and I take life. It's God's domain, not ours. We read that in Genesis 9. The teachings of the church. I've been reading from the United Methodist Book of Discipline the last few weeks. In the social principles section, we find very helpful guidance, how teachers in the church have looked at the scriptures and interpreted them and offer guidance for the people called Methodists. And on the faithful care of dying persons, we find this. While we applaud medical science for efforts to prevent disease and illness and for advances in treatment that extend the meaningful life of human beings, we recognize that every mortal life will ultimately end in death. Care for dying persons is part of our stewardship of the divine gift of life when cure is no longer possible. We encourage the use of medical technologies to provide palliative care at the end of life when life-sustaining treatments no longer support the goals of life and when they have reached their limits. There is no moral or religious obligation to use these when they impose undue burden or only extend the process of dying. Dying persons and their families are free to discontinue treatments when they cease to be a benefit to the patient. We recognize the agonizing personal and moral decisions faced by the dying, their physicians, their families, their friends, and their faith community. We urge that decisions faced by the dying be made with thoughtful and prayerful consideration by the parties involved, with medical, pastoral, and other appropriate counsel. We further urge that all persons discuss with their families, their physicians, and their pastoral counselors their wishes for care at the end of life and provide advance directives for such care when they are not able to make these decisions for themselves. We reject euthanasia and any pressure upon the dying to end their lives. God has continued love and purpose for all persons, regardless of health. We affirm laws and policies that protect the rights and dignity of the dying. The scriptures speak to us God's mind on issues as we approach the end of life. It invites us in important ways to understand that life is in God's domain. Jesus himself was committed to relieving the suffering of people, not by bringing death on, but by giving new life to people. One of the best illustrations we can come up with is Mother Teresa and her work in Calcutta, India, amongst the dying of that city. We are invited to follow God's lead in offering life to people. We are invited by the scriptures to a way in which we embrace God's gift of life to us, and we celebrate that gift each and every day of our lives. And we acknowledge the way of suffering as education for us. There are lessons to be taught, there are lessons to be learned as we reach out to people who are suffering and dying. I get it, and I hear people, and it concerns me that our culture is leaning towards disposable lives. A person no longer respects the sacredness of life. A couple finds out they're not ready to be parents. It'll force our plans to be put on hold. No problem, get an abortion. Dispose of the life. That way our dreams don't have to be put on hold. And at the end of life, people look and say, oh, look at Daddy. Oh my goodness, he's got dementia. He hasn't known me in years now. Oh, it's pitiful. He wouldn't want to be living like this. Can't we just give him something that ends his life, puts him and us out of this misery? No, no, no. We're losing the sacredness of life that God has given us. It's important that the church speaks on this issue, and we need to be heard. And we are heard when we reach out to those who are suffering and we care for them in their moment of need. We are heard when we remind the world of the sacredness of life. We are heard when we talk about the lessons we learn in suffering. I think that this is going to be an important issue in our culture for the coming 10 years. I know that these others that we've talked about are important, but this is the one that I see coming down the pike that's going to require a lot of thought, because I do fear that we are becoming a culture of disposable life. 9 states currently have death rights. You can choose to take medicine, assisted suicide, assisted death. 9 states have that. I think it's going to be pushed more and more by our society, and we need to engage in the conversation. We need to find common ground with those on the other side and talk about solutions to our problems. I want you to know that I've been a part of helping people die well. That teenager who was in the car wreck, I held the hands of his family members right after they made the decision to remove him from life support. And as he was being removed, we prayed. And we ushered him in prayer into the hands of our eternal God. He died with dignity. The woman with the severe skin cancer, I had the opportunity to officiate at her wedding between treatments at MD Anderson in Houston. The wedding took place in the chapel at Berry College, where she met her husband, and that's also where we had her funeral. She lived and she died with dignity. The woman in the assisted living home, that's my mother. My brother, sister, and I are committed to celebrating every day of life that she has with us, giving her the care that she needs, and loving her every step of the way. She lives and she will die in dignity. If there is a time that I will come and face that same kind of suffering, I pray that the Lord will give me strength and courage to face it, so that in the midst of suffering, I will find endurance. In endurance, I will find character. In character, I will find hope. Hope for me, hope for those around me. For hope does not disappoint us. Our hope is in the Lord who made heaven and earth. There's a common thread that runs through all of these sermons this month, and it is that life is a sacred gift to us by God. It is to be valued. It is that God is God and we are not. And so it's incumbent upon us, the church, to engage folks in conversation about this. I hear Gene Safer, we will not change one another's minds. But the conversation is important, and it needs to be respectful, and it needs to be a place where we look for empathy with each other, and we express God's desire for this world that God has created. I pray that the one who gives us life will guide you in the days to come. Amen.